My name is Claudio Acioly. I'm an architect and urban planner, and I work for UN Habitat. This session will go about something that lies very deep in my heart, something I'm very passionate about, that I've been fortunate to have so much experience, but also being exposed to the problem of slums. This session will go about what we call street-led citywide slum upgrading, in which we define the role of streets in creating better life, better neighborhood, better public space, and the connectivity of slums to the rest of the city, bringing citizenship, address, public space, and the recognition that slums is a place to live in dignity. This is part of a trilogy of work we've been doing in UN Habitat. We develop a strategy paper, then we develop a practical guide, how you move from project-based interventions to citywide programs, the steps you need to make, and then we develop training modules that we are applying and using with different city teams, and we hope that institutions, professionals will use this knowledge and the tools we've been developing to multiply and create a capacity around cities to address this fundamental problem, slums. The fundamental question is, why streets? Well, streets are not only the place for mobility or accessibility where cars pass, but it's not only the pathway where people transport themselves, where goods are transported. It is a common good. It's a public space. It's a public domain where social, cultural, economic activities are articulated, reinforced, and facilitated. This is why we use street as a point of departure. Well, it's a vital element to improve the quality of life in urban areas. It forges identity because it creates address, the place make for communities, individuals, business. So you create the physical location of people, addresses, where you can start or you provide the basis for the legalization of tenure and defining rights and obligations, both of the state but also of citizens, by means of property taxes and services and so on. Streets are also very important to define the urban pattern of a slum that will become a future neighborhood integrated to the city. So it's very important that we understand the role of streets, not only to create the physical structure, but the conditions for socio-economic integration and curbing what we call the social exclusion. Let's look, for example, in this case in São Paulo. In this photo, you can see very well that this is an informal area. The streets are not defined. It's very poor, the accessibility. You see the conditions of the housing. Now in the next photo, the moment you have an improvement of the street, the moment you have the public space, citizens start appropriating the space. They start investing on their private domain. They invest on house improvement, on creating an ambience where they can create communities. They create opportunities for business, like in this case, a supermarket that creates service for the residents, but also creates opportunities for income generation. And you see more and more that streets create this environment by means of gradually transforming this area, as you see elsewhere in the city. A public space that people can feel, can sit, can meet, can do business, and can walk through in a very well articulated space. Let's look at this case in Tirana, for example. In the periphery of the city, after the 90s, an incredible, remarkable, informal, unplanned urbanization took place. People were occupying available land, collective farms, and transforming. And then a group of professionals set up an NGO and start working with this resident and say, look, we have to define the public space, the future streets of these neighborhoods. And they actually got a recognition and a prize for this project. And they do not only define the physical space, but they start creating communities by getting people involved in improving and defining what was called the public space, but in fact, future streets that connect this area to the rest of Tirana. So now let's look at the problem of slums. The universal definition used by UN Habitat is very important because it allows us to define the scale and the magnitude of the problem and to monitor the implementation of or achievement of the Millennium Development Goal 7 Target 11. Well, the definition says that A slum dweller is one that lacks one or more of the following: the durability of housing, so whether the house is permanent, permanent or provisory building materials, inadequate living space because we want to measure overcrowding, inadequate access to improved sanitation and improved water, and lack of security of tenure, which translates into the protection against forced eviction. Now, in a nutshell, I would have to speak about 4 points. Urban growth has become a synonym of slum formation, which means cities are growing on the basis of informal land development and not on the basis of a plan, an enacted urban plan or a land use ordinance. We have an unprecedented informal and unplanned urbanization that is affecting the sustainability of cities. And now today we have that 1 out of every 3 urban dwellers lives in slum condition. So we have nearly 1 billion people living in these conditions. Now, if you look at this map, and this is the first time that Habitat actually put on a map the slum problems in a regional basis. And you see sub-Saharan African parts of Asia with 60–70% of the urban population living in slum condition. This is a serious problem. We need to address today, not tomorrow, but today. Now, here I'm going to give you the good and the bad news in this figure, which means in the green line, we see very well that in terms of proportion of the urban population, slum population is decreasing. This is good news. A lot of investment in housing, a lot of improvements in slums, so all these 5 elements being addressed. But the bad news is that in absolute numbers, the numbers are increasing and will continue to increase. And these are just images that have become very familiar in different parts of the world. I'm just going through these photos to show you that, the informal urbanization creates a liability for cities. Improving these conditions is not easy, is not cheap. The more we allow this to happen, the more problems we have. So we need to address this in a preventive, but also in a more improvement approach. So we see the scarcity of public space, places where basically you can hardly identify how people circulate and access these areas. In different parts, Asia, Africa, it doesn't matter, we see the pattern being repeated. So we argue very much that we need a different strategy. We talked about and we promote what we call a twin-track approach that promotes city-wide slum upgrading on one hand, and on the other hand, simultaneously with city-wide slum upgrading programs. So we provide housing opportunities to scale on one hand, and we improve the condition of those slums that are consolidated. Now, in other terms, in terms of strategy, we're talking about improvement policies and preventive policies. Improving means planning for development. There is an existing informal settlement, is existing slum, and we need to improve. We need to design approach to improve the quality of life. And on the other hand, planning before development, preparing cities to absorb this growth in a planned manner, creating and solving the land delivery bottlenecks, creating opportunities for housing at a scale, investing in urban infrastructure. These are some of the policies and strategies that help cities actually to prevent the multiplication formation of slums. We argue that this should be one single policy: slum upgrading strategy and urban housing strategy on the one hand. So the focus of my presentation, my session, is actually the planning for development, the area-based plan, opening the streets, creating area for infrastructure improvement, involving the residents, regularizing land, and so on. So we need a paradigm shift. We need to change, and we see from more than 50 years of experience in informal urbanization, informal slum upgrading, etc., shows that we must abandon the project-based piecemeal intervention and favor a more programmatic program scale. So we argue that we need 3 fundamental shifts: from piecemeal project-based interventions to program approach, to street-led slum upgrading as part of an area-based plan, and street-led citywide slum upgrading programs that are combined with strategies to deliver service, land, and housing at scale. So these are 3 elements of what we call a paradigm shift. Now you may ask, what is street-led citywide slum upgrading? Here is what we say, streets are incrementally implemented as a key element to define the area-based plan, which intrinsically connects the slum to the city, create an urban structure and the pathway for mobility, for business, for people, for social interaction, and so on and so on. So in this figure, you see the approach materialize a city that has a number of slums, and by defining the fundamental, most important prioritized streets, we can start connecting these areas to the rest of the city. So there are 4 elements that we consider very important in the street-led slum upgrading. First, involve the residents in planning and decision-making since the very beginning. Then, making a careful analysis of the patterns of streets that residents' perceptions have, or how they access, how they appropriate from the public space. So then we have to make choices of those streets that are chosen for improvement, and those who are like to bring the highest socioeconomic and physical and mobility outcome. And fourth and finally, we need to make sure that there is land either within or nearby the settlement, so that those houses and families that needs to be relocated in order to make room for the street and the urban structure of the slum, they can actually move away to a nearby area without affecting their social capital and their interlinkage with the other neighbors and families, etc. So these are the 4 elements we argue. So it's a phased approach, and in this figure you see very well that, from one street you go to another, and gradually you start integrating and creating a decent connectivity of these areas to the rest of the city. But, we have to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just arguing that the streets can play a fundamental role, and it can be cheaper, it can be feasible. We can start with the first most important streets and gradually, incrementally implementing the other streets and gradually creating a neighborhood out of these slums. So the experience around the world show, for example, in Lusaka, the Sites and Survey and Slum Upgrading Program in Lusaka, beginning in the 70s, demonstrated that streets can play a role in creating community participation and decision-making on the future area where people live. So planning your own roads. The ministry here in this case is promoting community participation by planning the streets. So defining a road committee and then going to the discussion, defining the area-based plan and the streets that are prioritized, and then agreeing with residents to demolish their own houses that need to be rebuilt somewhere else. So this has been done, so there is no secret, and it's possible. So if we can bring that to scale, and we can bring that within a program, we believe that it's possible to really start changing the situation of slums in the cities in the world. Now, this figure also shows the connectivity of the formal and informal, one that is planning the other, and gradually integrating these areas, you create a lot of opportunities for property regularization, for security of tenure, for business opportunity. You create an identity, an address. So we believe that this is an important strategy to pursue. Now let's look in another totally different context, the Rio de Janeiro Favela Bairro program. Here we have some lessons. Far from being perfect, this program provides us with very important lessons with more than 10 years of implementation. First, they identify the areas that were informal or illegal land occupation, the favelas. They map them, they identify, create a socioeconomic data about these areas, then identifying the typologies, then creating the program and defining the fundamental elements of this program. And as you see, sewerage improvement, accessibility, identifying the streets, creating squares, sports facilities, housing construction, we see very well that the street played a role, central role in the strategy which they used in several favela upgrading projects. Now, let's look at this example of Parque Royal. You see, the settlement was quite difficult in terms of accessibility. There were people living on top of water. They needed to be relocated to better housing. So the plan was first identify the resident that had to be relocated, and then create a plan, an area-based plan, where areas for relocation were identified, areas for public space defined, and once this was implemented, people could be transferred. Those who had to be demolished, they were transferred for a nearby area, and the settlement come out with a very clear structure, and the connectivity with the nearby neighborhood is quite clear, as you see in this photo. But the most important is how do you go to scale, to a program scale? And this is where the Rio Favela program is a very good lesson. Now, the municipality initiated the program by creating a competition for ideas with the Institute of Architects, the planning and architecture department firms, private firm. They responded with 50 plus ideas. Then they were, the best ones were commissioned to make the plans, and once the plans were ready, they went for tendering for implementation, and then the condition was that the community and the resident were involved both in the implementation of the plan, meaning preparing the plan, but also in the execution of the works. So it was a very interesting, and this inspired the Inter-American Development Bank to pursue similar models in other parts of Latin America. And you see some features, some photos of favelas, which you quite clear these areas being transformed into formal neighborhoods, gradually creating infrastructure, a path for pedestrian, a road for accessibility of for example, the truck that provides the gas bottles for the residents, and ambulance, etc., etc. And this created a history in the city where you could look at this photo and you say, well, this could be in any formal neighborhood, but it actually is a favela upgrading, which started from improving the streets as a point of departure. And now we go even to another scale in Medellin, in the nearby country in Colombia, where they had a significant amount of informal settlements with a totally disconnected and excluded from the city. And the goal was to define a plan which would connect these areas to the rest of the city by a very innovative public transport, but using this public transport as a way to create streets. So they had to actually pave the way to connectivity, so means identifying the houses, they had to be demolished, and they had to be compensated, and that had to be rebuilt within the area. The level of satisfaction of the residents is very high. Nowadays we observe along these streets and public spaces where you have libraries, where you have public service, there are a lot of social appropriation, business development are taking place. And people feel really proud, and people now feel safer. They feel identified with the area, and we see many positive developments coming out of this intervention. But this was done over and over, including in Indian cities where the slum networks did exactly the same, connecting the slums between them, identifying the infrastructure and the road connectivity that would connect all these areas to the rest of the city. So it's not something new. So the issue is, how do we move from piecemeal to program? We are suggesting 5 important stages of a street-led slum upgrading project. So creating the projects. So getting started, getting the plan, implementing the plan, and then the post-upgrading. Now getting started, doing the consultations with the residents, doing community mapping, enumeration, so doing an inventory, what we have in terms of infrastructure, in terms of social capital, so really getting the project development started. Then we prepare the plan with a maquette, with several illustrations to dialogue with the residents, designing the layout and the street pattern, and doing a lot of community participation in order to define the priorities of the streets that needs to be implemented, and then approving the street-led plan. Once this is approved, then we go with the final plan, either for procurement or municipalities who are able to implement with their public works department. They can easily pursue by let's say, the main street that has been approved, and making sure that we're doing this as part of an area-based plan. So we open the streets, we start regularizing land. We create housing reconstruction programs so that people can really be relocated, and we have here in this phase a lot of resettlement when the case requires. And then we have the post-upgrading, because this we should make sure that these areas are not transformed into slums. So we need to have a social pact with residents. So how do we maintain the public space? How do we do home improvement? What is the property tax and the user's charge that will be incurring on residents? How do we do the maintenance? So how do we do the management? So there are a lot of things to assure that these areas actually consolidate. There are some problems, and we have identified some obstacles which faces the adoption of what we propose as a city-wide, street-led approach to slum upgrading. And I'm going to outline 7 obstacles. There are probably a few, but the first one is the conventional planning, the attitude of planners. Now, we're dealing with an existing settlement. Our tools, our planning instruments have to be totally different than planning in a free land. So we need to accommodate. We cannot adopt like a blueprint approach to planning, different types of dialogues, participatory mechanisms that, it's no longer possible for us to define the framework alone. We need to involve the residents on that. Well, the scale is disproportional to the capacities and resources that we have in local authorities. And that's why we need to lower our expectations and adopt an incremental phased approach that on a street-per-street basis, I think we believe that municipalities will be able to implement. Also, the institutional organization capacity of municipalities are not always in place, so we need to create a very conducive institutional organizational environment so that a program with multiple interventions can take place and be well managed. Then the human resources at the local government level, at the city level, that plans and implements are not always well trained, not sufficiently up to date with the skills to deal with this problem in a programmatic, incremental way. And we see that local governments are not always enjoying the same kind of autonomy we observe in some areas, so they depend on others to act, so that is not conducive for cities to address their problem of slums in a direct, autonomous way. And cities are not using tools and instruments that are available for revenue generation, creating resources from land-based finance, land-based taxes, property tax, doing many partnerships to create resources. And then the 7th is that piecemeal project-based intervention are not helping to move to scale. It creates an obstacle that people and individuals and institutions start getting used to only to the punctual, isolated interventions and not going towards the scale. And there are finally 6 issues that we need to consider. And these are fundamental issues for the success. We must involve the residents and all stakeholders from the very beginning. The plan is a process and therefore dynamic. Cannot adopt a blueprint fixed planning. The plan is there to be changed and adapted because people have been living there for years and generations. The enumeration and mapping defines the size but also the scale of the problem, so it's an important step and it's key to know who lives and what conditions are found in these settlements. But you also identify rights of individuals. The street is the conduit and the starting point for the plan. And the subsequent development and integration of the slum into the formal city, as well as to ensure the security of tenure of its residents. So this is a very important element, so linking the street with security of tenure. And these investments in infrastructure that the streets create requires the area-based plan that defines the public and the private domain and fundamentally the street pattern. And finally, the occupation of land prior to the existence of a plan requires a process of co-management, which means we need to have the ability to deal with conflict and with the technocratic tradition of practitioners and planners so that we can reverse the order of the planning process, so that we actually do all with the residents that are living there. So this is what we have to tell you and share with you, and we hope that this becomes useful for an instrument, because we have a moral obligation to address the problems, because a large part of our brothers and sisters in this world is living in an inhuman condition that requires them to survive in a city that is full of opportunities, and they should enjoy these opportunities and be part of development. Thank you.